Mark was hit with a fine for something as small as his front door color. The HOA, led by the smug Karen Summers, thought they could intimidate him into silence. "You can waste your time with lawyers," she sneered, "but you'll never win." What Karen didn't know was that Mark had a secret weapon, a truth that would unravel everything. But let's start from the beginning. It was a beautiful summer morning in the peaceful suburban neighborhood of Greenbrook Heights. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the well-kept lawns and tidy homes. Mark Reynolds, a 36-year-old father of two and a proud homeowner, stepped out onto his front porch to take in the view of his quiet street. His house, which he had purchased 5 years ago, was his dream home. He had saved for years to make it a reality, and every inch felt like a reflection of his hard work. The scent of fresh-cut grass lingered in the air as Mark surveyed his surroundings. Birds chirped from the branches of the old oak tree in his front yard, and a soft breeze rustled through the leaves. His home was nestled on a peaceful cul-de-sac, the kind of place where neighbors waved to each other as they passed by. It was the kind of neighborhood that made you feel safe, a little slice of serenity in a busy world. Mark's front door, a deep shade of emerald green, was one of the things he loved most about the house. It wasn't gaudy or out of place, it was just a vibrant splash of color that brightened up the whole house. Mark had always dreamed of having a bold front door, something that would stand out and make a statement. He had chosen the green color with care. It was a tribute to his wife's favorite hue, a memory of their time spent together in a cozy cottage by the sea. Every time he looked at it, he felt connected to her, even in the quiet moments of the day. His family loved it too, often remarking how much it added to the charm of their home. But that morning, as Mark stood on his porch, taking in the quiet beauty of the neighborhood, he had no idea that this peaceful routine was about to be shattered. That afternoon, as he was preparing lunch for his kids, a letter was slipped under his door. It was from the Homeowners Association, HOA, of Greenbrook Heights, and it was a fine. Mark frowned as he picked up the envelope, the familiar logo of the HOA stamped across the top. He had always been wary of the HOA, but he had never imagined they would target him over something as trivial as the color of his front door. He tore open the envelope, his heart sinking as he read the contents. The notice stated that his door violated the HOA's approved color palette. According to the rules, all front doors were required to be neutral shades, beige, gray, or white. Mark felt a flush of anger rise in his chest. He hadn't received any prior warning or notice about his door being an issue. He had carefully chosen the color, and now this? This wasn't just an inconvenience. It felt like an attack on his right to express himself and enjoy his property. "Unbelievable," Mark muttered, feeling the blood rush to his head. His first instinct was to argue the fine, to fight back against what he saw as an unfair and petty rule. But his wife, Sarah, who had been standing by the kitchen counter listening to him, calmly placed a hand on his shoulder. "Mark," she said softly, "let's get some clarity first. We don't know all the details yet. Let's not jump into confrontation." Mark nodded, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. He didn't want to let this slide. This was his home, his family's home. How could the HOA dictate what color his front door could be? It didn't seem right. He tried to contact the HOA office immediately, dialing the number printed on the notice. His calls went unanswered. He sent an email. No reply. It felt like the organization was purposely avoiding him. The HOA's president, a woman named Karen Summers, was notoriously difficult to reach. Mark had heard stories of her cold demeanor and strict enforcement of the community rules, no matter how trivial. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like this wasn't just about the color of his door. It felt personal. "Why won't they even respond?" Mark muttered, frustration building. "It's like they don't care about us at all." Sarah, sensing his rising anger, suggested again that they try to remain calm. "We need to handle this the right way, Mark. Let's not do anything rash." But it wasn't easy. The more Mark thought about it, the more it grated on him. His family had worked hard to get to this point, to live in a place they loved, and now it felt like an outside force was threatening to take that away, all over a color. "I know exactly how this feels. It's like a constant weight on your shoulders, knowing that someone else is trying to control something so personal, so important." "How could anyone be okay with that?" the narrator softly added, as if speaking directly to the audience. Mark's pain and frustration? It's something many of us can relate to. We've all been told we can't do something we love, haven't we? Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a fine. This was a battle for his right to live the way he saw fit, to express himself in a small but significant way. He wasn't going to let it slide. He just needed a chance to explain himself, to make them understand. But it seemed like the HOA wasn't even interested in hearing him out. He took a deep breath, glancing out the window at his green door. It stood there, bold and unyielding, just as it had always been. For a moment, Mark considered ignoring the fine, simply refusing to comply, but he knew that wouldn't solve anything. This wasn't just a question of door color anymore. It was about respect. It was about standing up for what was right, for what he and his family had worked so hard to build. Determined not to back down, Mark set out to research the HOA's rules and regulations. His anger had simmered into a quiet, steely resolve. He couldn't let this stand. He couldn't let them make him feel small over something as trivial as the color of his front door. Mark sat down at his desk, his fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard as he began to comb through the HOA's website. Hours passed as he dug deeper into their documents, scrolling through bylaws and old newsletters. The approved color palette rule had been in place for years, but it was clear that it wasn't a rule that had ever been enforced rigorously. As Mark sifted through the records, a nagging frustration began to take hold. Other homes in the neighborhood, homes that weren't marked for violations, had doors painted in colors similar to his. Some had bright blue doors, others flaunted bold reds or earthy oranges. His green door wasn't an anomaly, it was simply a matter of selective enforcement. He couldn't help but feel the weight of injustice pressing down on him. How could they just pick on him like this? The narrator's voice asked softly. It's not just about the door color, it's about fairness, about a system that's supposed to be equal but isn't. How would you feel if it was you? Mark slammed the folder of documents onto his desk, frustration bubbling up again. It wasn't just the inconsistency, it was the way the HOA had handled the whole situation. They hadn't sent a friendly reminder or made any effort to have a conversation. Instead, they had sent a fine, curt and threatening, as if he had committed a crime. He had done nothing wrong, nothing that deserved this kind of treatment. How could anyone justify making him feel like a criminal over a simple color? Mark's fingers clenched into fists as he thought about how he had tried to do the right thing. He had invested in this house with his own hard-earned money, dreaming of a place where his family could thrive. And now, he felt like the rules that were supposed to protect him were being used against him. He paced around the room, deep in thought. That's when he decided to take action. This wasn't just about standing up for his front door anymore. It was about standing up for himself, for his family, and for the kind of community they had chosen to live in. Mark turned back to his computer, pulling up legal websites, researching his rights as a homeowner. He found that while HOA rules were enforceable, they were still subject to state laws governing property rights. He was surprised to learn that he had more power than he initially thought. It's empowering, isn't it? The narrator chimed in with warmth, realizing that you have the right to defend your home, your space. Mark's not alone in this fight. You have the right to stand up too. Don't forget that. Mark's eyes scanned through the dense legal jargon, but he was determined to get the answers he needed. He wasn't going to be bullied into submission by some arbitrary rule. He was starting to feel a little more confident, but he knew that navigating this would be complicated. That's when he stumbled upon something else that sent a chill down his spine. Karen Summers, the president of the HOA, had a history. It wasn't just about enforcing the rules, it was about selectively enforcing them. According to online forums and local community boards, Karen had built a reputation for being overly strict, issuing fines for the smallest infractions while turning a blind eye to more severe violations from residents she favored. Mark felt a surge of indignation. This wasn't about him simply breaking a rule. It was about an unfair system, one that allowed some people to bend the rules while others suffered under them. Now, this feels personal, the narrator's voice dropped, filled with empathy. How can you trust a system that's so blatantly biased? It's hard not to feel like Mark is being unfairly singled out, don't you think? Mark couldn't let it go. He wouldn't. He needed to know his rights, and he needed to take the next step. He picked up the phone and dialed the number for a local lawyer determined to get legal advice. He didn't know what the future held, but he was sure of one thing. This wasn't the end of it. He looked out the window at his emerald green door, the color now a symbol of his defiance. He wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. He had to fight for what was right, even if it meant going up against the very organization that had once promised to protect his neighborhood. "The moment of truth is here," the narrator whispered as the tension hung thick in the air. Mark's about to take the first step into something bigger than a door. It's a fight for fairness, for standing up for yourself, and for the people who matter most. We've all been there, haven't we? Trying to fight for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against us. Mark set the phone down after scheduling his appointment with the lawyer. His heart was pounding, but a sense of clarity had settled in his chest. This wasn't just about a door. This was about more than that. This was about fighting for fairness. And no matter how small or large the battle, he was ready to fight. Mark knew that it was time to stop worrying alone. He needed someone who could help him navigate this maze of rules, fines, and unfair treatment. So he reached out to a local attorney, Jennifer Carter, who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. As soon as Mark explained his situation, Jennifer was quick to review the HOA's letter. Her sharp eyes scanned the document, and after only a few moments, she looked up, her face filled with disbelief. "This is outrageous," Jennifer said, shaking her head. "There's no justification for this fine, and frankly, I believe they've overstepped their bounds." Mark could feel a wave of relief wash over him. Finally, someone who understood. Jennifer explained that, according to property law, the HOA had no right to impose such fines without first issuing a warning or providing an opportunity for the homeowner to appeal. "They can't just send a fine without giving you a chance to correct it," she said, her tone firm. "And the fact that they're selectively enforcing the rules, that's another issue." Jennifer was already gathering steam. If other residents were allowed to keep their colorful doors, then you have a strong case for unfair treatment. You're being singled out. Mark felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't imagining it. This was wrong. As the days passed, Mark and Jennifer worked tirelessly. They started by documenting the colors of other houses in the neighborhood: bright blues, vivid reds, even pastel yellows. Each one stood as proof that Mark was not the only one with a non-neutral front door. They also began collecting statements from neighbors who had never received fines for similar infractions. Mark even spoke with one neighbor who'd been living in Greenbrook Heights for over a decade, and they had never once been fined for their door color. But what really shocked them was when they uncovered something even more damning. They found out that the HOA had fined a resident for a door color change that had been approved by the previous administration. It was yet another example of the arbitrary enforcement of rules, and it made Mark's blood boil. "Can you believe it?" the narrator's voice asked softly. "How can something like this happen? A rule that's supposed to keep things fair is being used to make people miserable. It's the kind of thing that makes you question everything. You'd feel the same way, wouldn't you?" But the HOA wasn't backing down. In fact, Karen Summers, the HOA president, became increasingly aggressive. Mark's mailbox was flooded with more threatening letters, each one escalating in tone. She even went so far as to threaten to place a lien on Mark's property, a desperate, petty move meant to intimidate him into submission. Mark felt the pressure, but he wasn't intimidated. He couldn't let her win. Not now, not after everything he had learned. With Jennifer's help, Mark drafted a formal complaint, demanding that the HOA revoke the fine and cease all further actions against him. In the letter, he clearly stated that if they didn't resolve the issue quickly, he would take legal action. "Mark, we've got everything we need," Jennifer said confidently as she reviewed the final draft of the letter. "This is a strong case. They're in the wrong here, and they know it. If they want to keep pushing, they'll have to answer for it." The morning Mark dropped the letter in the mail, he felt a sense of resolve he hadn't experienced in weeks. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally fighting back. Not just for himself, but for his family, and for the values of fairness and justice that he held dear. You know, sometimes it takes more than just standing your ground. the narrator whispered, voice full of admiration. Sometimes it takes courage to stand up and say, I won't be pushed around. And Mark, he's doing exactly that. He's not giving in to intimidation, not letting fear dictate his actions. And honestly, isn't that the kind of hero we all need? The tension in Mark's chest had loosened, but a storm was still brewing in the distance. He knew this battle was far from over, but with Jennifer by his side, he was ready. He wouldn't let the HOA or anyone bully him into submission. This fight was about more than just a door. It was about standing up for what was right. And Mark Reynolds wasn't about to back down. Mark was no longer just a homeowner fighting over a door color. As his investigation into the HOA deepened, something far darker began to emerge. It wasn't just about rules and fines, it was about abuse of power, corruption, and personal gain. One quiet evening, after hours of combing through HOA financial records with Jennifer, Mark stumbled upon something shocking. There, buried in the accounting sheets, were discrepancies, small at first, then more glaring. It appeared Karen Summers, the HOA president, had been using the community's funds for personal expenses, including renovations on her own property. Mark's stomach twisted as he pieced together the information. Karen had been diverting HOA money for her own benefit, misappropriating funds meant for community upkeep. It was a scandal waiting to explode. Wait, Jennifer said, pointing at the screen. Look at this. These are invoices for work done on her house, paid out of the HOA budget. She looked up at Mark, her voice low. This is worse than we thought. She's been using the HOA as her personal piggy bank. Mark felt his blood run cold. His mind raced. It wasn't just the unfair fines. It wasn't just the rule enforcement. It was corruption at its core. We need to go public with this, he said, his voice steady despite the fury rising inside him. How can one person in a position of power do something so monstrous? The narrator's voice wondered aloud. I mean, it's one thing to break a rule, but this goes beyond greed. This is betrayal on every level. Can you imagine the anger Mark must have felt? But the breakthrough didn't end there. The next day, Mark received a call from an unexpected source. A whistleblower, a former contractor who had worked with the HOA, came forward, offering information that would shatter the case wide open. The contractor, who asked to remain anonymous, revealed that Karen had been using her influence to selectively enforce the HOA's rules. She had allowed certain residents, those she liked or who had done favors for her, to break the rules without penalty, while others, like Mark, were hit with harsh fines for minor infractions. The anger inside Mark grew into something sharper, colder. He wasn't just fighting for his right to a green door anymore. He was fighting against the system of corruption, discrimination, and abuse. This was bigger than him now. This was about justice. With Jennifer's legal expertise, they began to gather their evidence, financial records, the contractor's testimony, documents from neighbors who had witnessed Karen's selective enforcement. It was all adding up, and the case was becoming impossible to ignore. You know what's so heartbreaking about this, the narrator said, voice full of quiet fury. It's that Karen didn't just hurt Mark. She hurt the entire neighborhood, taking advantage of the trust they placed in her. She made them all feel powerless, small, afraid. But Mark, he's not letting her get away with it, and that's what makes this story so important. It's not just about standing up for yourself. It's about standing up for everyone. Mark knew it was time to take action. With Jennifer's blessing, he took the case to the local news. The story spread like wildfire. Headlines began to appear in the papers. HOA president accused of financial mismanagement, and Greenbrook Heights HOA under fire for discriminatory practices. The public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Karen, once so confident in her power, was now facing an avalanche of scrutiny. The pressure was mounting, and Karen's facade began to crack. Her phone started ringing off the hook with calls from reporters, investigators, and concerned residents. Mark could almost hear her desperation through the silence on the other end of the line when she tried to call him, her voice shaky, demanding he back off. You can almost feel the weight of it all, can't you? The narrator asked, their voice filled with quiet sympathy. The pressure, the realization that she couldn't control the narrative anymore. But Mark, he's got the truth on his side. He's got the whole community on his side, and no amount of lies or threats is going to stop him now. Meanwhile, Mark's attorney filed a formal lawsuit demanding that Karen be held accountable for her actions. The case became a symbol for the fight against HOA abuse and the power of standing up for what was right. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out, too intimidated by the HOA's power, began offering their support. Some gave testimony, others rallied behind Mark, a collective voice rising to challenge the corruption that had been allowed to fester for too long. As the investigation unfolded, more and more details about Karen's misconduct came to light. It wasn't just financial mismanagement. There were personal favors, preferential treatment, and a whole system of manipulation that had been used to control the residents of Greenbrook Heights. The truth, like a floodgate opening, was unstoppable. Mark had started out fighting for a simple principle: fairness. But now, with the whole neighborhood watching, it was clear that this fight was about something far bigger, about exposing the truth and holding those in power accountable. And Mark? He wasn't going to let anyone intimidate him into silence. The battle was far from over, but he knew one thing for sure. The truth was on his side, and nothing could take that away. The day of the trial had arrived, and the air around Greenbrook Heights felt thick with anticipation. Mark stood outside the courthouse, his heart pounding in his chest. His hands were cold, but his resolve was stronger than ever. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the truth would finally come to light. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Mark's legal team had painstakingly gathered a mountain of evidence, from the discriminatory enforcement of HOA rules to the financial fraud committed by Karen Summers. The courtroom felt heavy, every word and every gesture amplified by the weight of the case. Mark could see Karen sitting across the room, once confident and smug, but now visibly nervous, her eyes darting around the room, unable to meet his gaze. Her usual air of superiority was gone, replaced by a stark, palpable fear. The judge, an older man with a sharp gaze, looked over the papers in front of him. He cleared his throat and, in a voice that was both firm and composed, began to speak. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Mark. Can you imagine how Mark must have felt in that moment? The narrator's voice broke in, full of quiet emotion. The weight of it all, the years of frustration, the fear, the stress, all melting away as the truth was finally heard, as it should have been from the beginning. The judge's words echoed through the room as the ruling continued. The fine imposed by the HOA is hereby annulled. Additionally, the court has determined that Mr. Mark is entitled to damages in the amount of $100,000 for emotional distress and legal fees. Mark's head spun for a moment. $100,000. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the validation. It was about the fact that against all odds he had won. His fight had been worth it, and it didn't stop there. As part of the ruling, the judge continued, his voice unwavering. Karen Summers is hereby removed from her position as HOA president, and she is ordered to repay the HOA funds she misappropriated. The words landed like a hammer. Mark's victory was not only legal, but personal. Karen, who had used her power to manipulate and control, who had tried to crush his spirit, was being held accountable. The justice that had been denied to him and to so many others was finally being served. Honestly, this moment is the kind of victory we all dream of, right? The narrator mused, standing up to someone who thought they were untouchable. And here's Mark, proving that even the smallest voice can be a powerful force when it stands up for what's right. As the judge finished his ruling, Mark felt a surge of relief. He couldn't believe it. He had done it. His green door, the symbol of his fight, was not just a rebellious act anymore. It was a symbol of his triumph, of his commitment to justice. And now, it had become a symbol for the whole neighborhood. The victory rippled out, affecting more than just Mark and Karen. With public pressure mounting, the HOA was forced to revise its bylaws to ensure greater transparency and fairness in its operations. Gone were the days when powerful figures could exploit the system. The community, once divided, once afraid, came together, empowered by Mark's courage. They voted in a new board of directors, a group committed to accountability and fairness. The people had spoken, and their voices had been heard. The changes were swift. As the news spread through the community, Mark saw his neighbors, those who had once avoided confrontation, standing tall, confident, and proud. They offered their support to him, sending messages of thanks, and some even came forward to share their own experiences with the HOA's unfair practices. It was as if the entire neighborhood was waking up, realizing they had the power to change things. "Can you feel the weight of that?" the narrator asked softly. "The collective power of a community united. It's incredible." And all it took was one person, Mark, having the courage to stand up and say, "No more." For Mark and his family, the relief was immense. They could finally breathe again, free from the shadow of the HOA's oppression. His children, once scared to leave the house in case someone came by to issue another fine, now ran around the front yard, their laughter echoing through the air. The front door, still green, proudly stood as a beacon of defiance, a reminder that standing up for what's right could lead to change. But, more importantly, Mark had done something far bigger than simply fighting for his right to paint his door the color he wanted. He had fought for fairness, for his dignity, and for the principles of justice that he believed in. He had reminded everyone that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. And you know what? The narrator's voice softened, filled with pride. In the end, Mark's victory wasn't just about one man against a corrupt system. It was about all of us. It's about the strength we all have to stand up to injustice. Mark didn't just win a case, he set a precedent. As the story of Mark's victory spread, it became clear that his fight would inspire others across the country. People who had suffered in silence, who had feared retribution, now saw that they too could fight back. They could stand up against those who abused their power. And so Mark's fight, his victory, became something much larger than himself. It became a rallying cry for fairness, for dignity, for justice. A reminder that even in the face of corruption, one person's courage could spark a change that ripples out, touching the lives of many.